So welcome everyone to our weekly Torah studies class for the portion of the era, line in the sand. Sometimes we must be unequivocal. So the style of today's class is going to be a little bit different than some of the previous classes. We are going to jump right into the middle of a really incredible debate, disagreement, argument perhaps, between a few commentaries on how we interpret the events surrounding the first three plagues that took place in Egypt. And we're going to appear that one of them makes the stronger argument, and we're going to spend the rest of the class defending what at first might have appeared to be the weaker argument. So we're going to jump right in. The Torah portion of Va'era has 7 of the 10 plagues. There's 7 in this week's Torah portion. There's 3 in next week's Torah portion. Just before God is about to administer the 4th plague to the Egyptians, a warning is delivered. So text number 1 from this week's Torah portion of Shemos, chapter 8, verse 18. And I will separate on that day the land of Goshen, upon which my people stand. There will be no mixture of noxious creatures there, in order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. So the message that's being relayed is, there is going to be a plague that I'm going to inflict upon the Egyptians. The plague is going to be wild animals. What are you going to notice at this plague? That there's a difference between the Egyptians and the Jews who are living in the land of Goshen. The Torah says, I will separate on that day the land of Goshen. There is not going to be wild animals destroying, damaging, injuring, killing Jews who are living in the land of Goshen. Rather, is going to be reserved. It's going to be restricted specifically upon the Egyptians. Why is that going to be the case? In order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. That's the point. So the first time that the Torah makes any mention that there's a difference between the Jews and the Egyptians when it comes to the plagues that God is inflicting upon Egypt, it is with this plague, the 4th plague, the plague of wild animals. Why? So the Egyptians will realize that there is a God, there's a creator of heaven and earth, he's the master of the universe. It is in order that they should be aware. This, of course, leads to a very obvious question. Why does the Torah make this statement with the 4th plague? What about the first 3 plagues? Did the first 3 plagues afflict the Jews and the Egyptians? And therefore the Torah tells us that no, only the 4th plague didn't affect the Jews and the Egyptians? What happened to the other 3 plagues? So we're going to begin with the commentary of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. He was born in the year 1092. He passed away in the year 1167. He was a biblical commentator, linguist, and poet. Ibn Ezra was born in Toledo, Spain, and fled the Almohad regime to other parts of Europe. It is believed that he was living in London at the time of his death. Ibn Ezra is best known for his literalist commentary on the Pentateuch. He also wrote works of poetry, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and other topics. So an incredible Jew with a very important commentary on the Torah, with an emphasis on a literal understanding of the verses. And it's fascinating that he died in London in 1167. You think, what kind of Jewish community was in London in 1167, 1,000 years ago? But the reality is there actually was quite a Jewish community, and it was only about 100 years later when unfortunately the Jews were massacred and then were expelled from England. So let's see what the Ibn Ezra has to say. And they dug. Many have said that water that was red like blood when in the hand of an Egyptian became clear in the hand of a Hebrew. If that is so, why is this miracle not recorded in the Torah? So the Ibn Ezra is referencing various Jewish sources that stated that the plague of blood only affected the Egyptians it did not affect the Jews. In fact, if they were drinking from the same cup, the Jew would have water, the Egyptian would have blood. So the Ibn Ezra says, sounds great. However, it doesn't say that in the biblical text. If that miracle took place, the Ibn Ezra says it should have said it in the biblical text. As we mentioned before, he is a literalist. That doesn't mean he doesn't believe in midrashic texts. It means that if he wants things to at least be hinted at, alluded to, somehow you see it in the words. He says we don't see it in the words. In my view, following the simple meaning of the scriptures, the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice included the Egyptians and the Hebrews. These three plagues did not cause much harm, only for the plague of the wild animals, which was more destructive. And subsequent plagues did God distinguish between the Egyptians and Israel. So the Ibn Ezra says, based on the literal reading of the verses in the Torah, the Jewish people were afflicted with blood, with frogs, and with lice, the first three plagues, just as the Egyptians were. Because based on the biblical text, based on the way the verses go, there's no reason to make any distinction or difference between the Jews and Egyptians, especially when the Torah tells us that with the fourth plague, then God will make a separation. There was no such mention before. He answers the obvious question, why would that be the case? And he answers very simply that these plagues are not that destructive. They were not that damaging. The Nile River was turned to blood. Perhaps the Jews had other wells, right? They were able to get water in a different way. The frogs were jumping all over the place. All right, it's probably annoying to have frogs jumping all over the place, but it's not long-term damage. Lice, they're itchy, they're uncomfortable, but you survive. It wasn't until God started raining down terrible, damaging, violent, deadly plagues that a separation was made. Why does the Ibn Ezra say this? Because his approach to the Bible, to the Torah, is much more literalistic. He wants to see it in the text and in the words. However, there are other commentaries who disagree with the Ibn Ezra. Rabbeinu Bachai, the Ramban, the Radbaz, and we're going to get to their approach right now. The Rabbeinu Bachai, who's text number 3, he was born in 1255, passed away in the year 1340. He is a biblical commentator. He lived in Spain and was a disciple of Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, known as the Rashba. He's best known for his multifaceted commentary on the Torah, which interprets the text on literal, midrashic, philosophical, and Kabbalistic levels. Rabbeinu Bechaya also wrote Kad HaKemach, a work on philosophy and ethics. So Rabbeinu Bechaya is going to challenge the literalist interpretation of Ibn Ezra. And I will separate on that day. Inasmuch as the first plagues were relatively stationary, it was unremarkable that they occurred in the central part of Egypt and not in Goshen where the Jews lived. By contrast, wild animals wreak havoc everywhere. When these beasts came on God's command from the desert to destroy everything, it's only natural that they would reach Goshen as well. Since it was also part of the land of Egypt, the Jews were only spared because of a miracle from God. So Rabbeinu Bechaya says, there is no way that the Jews were afflicted with the plague of blood. There's no way the Jews were afflicted with the plague of frogs. There's no way that the Jews were afflicted with the plague of lice. Why does the Torah tell us that with the fourth plague, there was a clear separation between the Egyptians and the Jews? It's because in the fourth plague, it was much more obvious. The perception that there was a clear difference between the Jews and the Egyptians was more obvious. When it came to blood, okay, the blood was localized with the Nile River, perhaps in the capital, right? The frogs, they jumped out of the Nile River only in the capital, right? The lice was a localized phenomenon. But when it came to wild beasts invading the country of Egypt, that was a clear difference, that there was no wild animals in Goshen and only wild animals in Egypt. So the idea that there was a difference between the Jews and the Egyptians became clear and obvious in the fourth plague. This is the position of Rabbeinu Bachaya. The Radbaz argues even further. Now, who is the Radbaz? The Radbaz is Rabbi David ibn Zimra. He was born in 1479, passed away in 1573. He was a noted halachic authority. The Radbaz was born in Spain and emigrated to Safas, Israel, upon the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. In 1513, he moved to Egypt and served as rabbi, judge, and head of the yeshiva in Cairo. He also ran many successful businesses and was independently wealthy. In 1553, he returned to Sfas, where he would later be buried. He authored what would later become a classic commentary to Maimonides' Code of Law and wrote many halachic responsa, of which more than 10,000 are extant. So if you want a window into what Jewish life was like in the 16th century, around the time of the expulsion of Jews from Spain, Jewish life in Egypt, Jewish life in Israel in the following century, the Radbaz is a wealth of information, insight into the community, the struggles that they had, and the halachic questions that he had to answer. And it's a treasure trove, over 10,000 questions that he answered and responded to, and we have that today. So he responds to the Ibn Ezra. He says, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra writes that Egypt and Israel were both subject to the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice. It's forbidden to believe such a thing, especially since scripture itself indicates the opposite. So already you can see the strong language that the Radbaz is using. He says, and Egypt could not drink from the river, and all of Egypt dug around the river. The implication being that the Israelites did not need to do this, since they were drinking from the river's waters. So the Radbaz says, if you want to rely only on the biblical text says the Egyptians couldn't drink the water. The Egyptians dug around the water. So obviously it only affected the Egyptians, right? The Jews didn't have to dig around. The Jews didn't have any other issues. There's no way the Jews were affected. So the Radbaz turns the emphasis on the literal interpretation of the verses right on Ibn Ezra's head. He says the verse tells us that the Egyptians couldn't drink. The verse tells us what happened to the Egyptians. Clearly, the plague only affected the Egyptians. And so it is said when Moshe warned of the frogs that they will come up into you and into your people, and then later that they will depart from you and from your houses and from your servants and from your people, implied is that they were not in Israel. The same is true of lice. From where it's clear, we can infer to where it is not clear. So again, the Radbaz says, using your biblical literalist interpretation, the Torah tells us when it came to the frogs, they'll come up into your land, into your house, and your servants, and your people. It's all the Egyptians. The Torah is telling us it afflicted the Egyptians, not the Jews. And then he concludes, I fail to understand. If the plague was also on Israel, then what proof did it hold for Paro that he should send the Israelites from his land? I shouldn't have bothered wasting ink on this sort of thing, but I did not want to give any space to those who speak falsely regarding the words of our sages. So the Radbaz was quite strident. He was quite strong. He wasn't mincing any words with what he thought of the Ibn Ezra's comment. And he asked such a powerful question. Number one, from a biblical perspective, from the verses themselves, it's pretty clear that these things only affected the Egyptians. The Jews were not mentioned at all. And from a logical perspective, what would the point be of inflicting plagues on the Jewish people? Why would the Jews have all their water turned into blood? Why do the Jews have to have frogs jumping in their kitchen and in their beds and in their bathtubs? Why? Why should the Jews be up all night itchy and scratching lice? If the plagues were punishments for the Egyptians, it simply makes no sense that the Jews would have been affected by those three plagues as well. Because I can't even believe I have to respond to this type of thing. It just doesn't make any sense. What we want to do in the rest of the class today is defend the position of the Ibn Ezra. We're not saying the Ibn Ezra was right. We're not saying the Radbaz was wrong. But we're saying what we're trying to do is paint a fuller picture of where the Ibn Ezra is coming from, and that even from the perspective of the Ibn Ezra, it makes sense, there's truth to it, there's holiness to it, and ultimately there's a lesson that we can derive from it. So there's a simple way to answer the first challenge of the Radbaz. The Radbaz's first challenge was the verses themselves testify that the Egyptians couldn't drink from the Nile and they had to dig up. The verse themselves tells us that the Egyptians' houses were full of frogs. That must mean the Jews didn't have it. So you could answer this question by saying the focus of the plagues was the Egyptians. Therefore, it was not addressed as to whether the Jews had it or not. Because what is the topic that's under discussion? The topic under discussion is Moshe says to Paro, if you don't let the Jews go, I'm going to inflict plagues upon you. So therefore, the Torah tells us that God afflicted plagues on the Egyptians. They had to dig for water. They had frogs jumping all over the place. It's not saying that there was no plague on the Jews. The topic under the discussion is the plagues under the Egyptians. So perhaps on a literal biblical answer, maybe you can get away with it. But the second question is a lot harder to answer. Why would God inflict plagues against the Jewish people? So to answer this, we need to understand what was the reasoning behind the plagues. If we understand why God inflicted plagues on the Egyptians, then perhaps it might make sense why the Jewish people also had to experience the first three plagues as well. Why would God let the Jews be afflicted by any of the plagues? How do we explain Ibn Ezra's explanation? If we get the answer to question number one, we will know the answer to question number two, and then we will successfully be able to defend the position of the Ibn Ezra. All right. Just got to move a few pages over here. So to really understand where Ibn Ezra is coming from, and to make this all make a little bit more sense, we need to understand the purpose of the plagues. Why did God decide to send 10 plagues to the Egyptians? Reason number one, so that the Egyptians would free the Jewish people. The goal of 10 plagues is so that the Egyptians would say, we're not doing this anymore. We can't handle this. It is not worth having the Jews as slaves if we're going to be inflicted by these punishments all the time. Goal number one, free the Jews. Goal number two, to punish the Egyptians. The Egyptians perpetrated an unbelievable crime against the Jewish people. They deserve to be punished. It is only right. It is only just. Reason number three, to bring the Egyptians to an awareness of God. So it wasn't only to free the Jews. It wasn't only to punish the Egyptians, but there was a powerful theological statement that was being made. The Egyptians were pagan idol worshipers. They needed to get the message. They needed to understand that there is one God who created heaven and earth, and he runs the show. So all of these 3 points were critical into why God afflicted the Egyptians. How do we know this to be true? The Torah, in fact, tells it to us. Let's look at what the Torah has to say. Text number 7. the Parsha of Shemos. Sorry, the book of Shemos, chapter 8, verse 17. For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will incite against you and against your servants and against your people and in your house a mixture of noxious creatures. And the house of Egypt will be filled with the mixture of noxious creatures as well as the land upon which they are. Why is God afflicting the plague of noxious creatures of wild animals? In order to let my people go. So that's, we know, what are the plagues supposed to accomplish? Reason number one, let my people go. What about punishing them? The Torah, the book of Bereshis, we're going back now to the book of Bereshis, chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. God made a covenant with Abraham. He tells them one day your grandchildren are going to be slaves in a foreign country, but don't worry, I will punish those who enslave them. And God said to Avram, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. And also the nation that they will serve will I judge, and afterwards they will go forth with great possessions. So the Egyptians are being judged. They're being punished for their cruelty to the Jewish people. That's reason number two. What about reason number three? We look to the book of Shemos, chapter 7, verse 17. So said God, with this you will know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it will turn to blood. So the Torah tells us clearly, with this you will know. With these plagues, you will know that I'm the Lord. So now we have three reasons why God afflicted plagues on the Egyptians. And what's interesting is that reason number three has nothing to do with freeing the Jews, and it has nothing to do with punishing the Egyptians. It's to send a theological message. The point of the message is there is a God who created the world. There's one God. He's in charge. He's the master of all. So that would be a reason enough to send a plague. It would not be relevant what happens to the Jews or what happens to the Egyptians. What's relevant is that a message comes across that God is in charge of everything. That's the most important thing. And this was the main goal of all of the 10 plagues, but it was seen very clearly in the first three. The first of the three, the first three plagues, God was sending a very clear theological message. He was directly attacking the pagan beliefs of Egypt. What did the Egyptians worship perhaps more than anything else? It was the Nile River. The Nile River was the source of Egyptian life and livelihood. It was their water. It was what watered their fields. It was what either irrigated their crops. It was constant, and it was critical for their life and for their survival. It was at the center of Egypt. They worshiped it. It was a god. What did God do? He directly attacked the Nile River. He transformed it into blood. You think that the Nile River is your source of life? I can turn it into the source of death like that. You think that the Nile River is your source of life? I will make millions of frogs ascend from the Nile River and destroy you. I can make the Nile River death and destruction just like this, because God is the creator of heaven and earth, right? Rashi makes this comment right here in the Parsha. He struck their deity, then he struck them. The point of the first three plagues, not just for freedom, not just for punishment, but to teach this theological message. And it landed hard in the first two plagues attacking the Nile River. However, the Torah itself says that the Egyptians were expert magicians, conjurers, and they actually had the spiritual talent, so to speak, to manipulate nature and were able to turn water into blood and to produce frogs. So they were skeptical after the first two plagues. So therefore, the third plague of lice carried an even more powerful theological message. What was it? The Egyptian magicians could not reproduce the plague. They could not create lice. It was beyond their magical abilities, and this is what they said. So the necromancer said to Paro, "It is the finger of God." But Paro's heart remained steadfast, and he did not hearken to them as God had spoken. But the Egyptian magicians, the necromancers, right, the spiritual leaders of the time of the pagan religions in Egypt, after plague number 3, they testified that this could only be from the finger of God. So the first 3 plagues were sent to teach this most powerful theological message. Based on this, we now can understand why Ibn Ezra could possibly make such a statement that the first 3 plagues affected not just the Egyptians, but even the Jewish people. Why? Because the point of the plagues was to send a theological message. For that theological message to be effective, it had to even affect the Jews. Why? The first 3 plagues were specifically aimed at completely refuting the Egyptian conception of deities. That's what had to happen. It had to be complete. In order to prove God's oneness, without a shred of doubt, the plague had to affect clearly and consistently. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile. They viewed the Nile as a god. If the Nile only turned to blood in Egyptian areas, but it didn't turn to blood in Jewish areas, they could have said, you know what? All right, you got a powerful God, but not that powerful. He's not capable of transforming the entire Nile into blood. The Nile remains somewhat independent, somewhat powerful, somewhat in control. Your God, okay, he's got some muscles, but limited. Could not, cannot completely turn the Nile into blood. Therefore, God had to make sure that the Nile River that flowed through the Jewish community in Goshen had to be turned to blood as well. It had to be complete control. The same thing when it would apply to the frogs. If the frogs only appeared out of the Nile in Cairo or wherever the Paro was living at the time, but not from the Nile in Goshen, the Egyptians could say the same thing. God is limited. God is not all powerful. The same thing with lice. If only the dust in Egyptian areas turned into lice, but not the dust where the Jews lived, again, they would say God is limited. God is not all powerful. He cannot control all of the dust. Therefore, we don't believe in him. So in order for there to be this theological message, it had to be complete. It had to be absolute. No distinctions, even though that meant the Jewish people were going to suffer from those first 3 plagues as well. We go to text number 11 here in the words of the Rebbe himself, Likutei Sichos, volume number 11, page 32. Based on the above, we can understand. As Rashi explains, God brought the first 2 plagues to strike their deity. For this reason, the first 2 plagues had to also affect the Israelites' water. And as much as their deity was being struck by the plagues had to be wherever their deity was to be found. Right? You had to knock out the Nile River completely, everywhere, total. If not, Paro could have thought that this particular section of his deity, The part in the Hebrew territory of Goshen was indeed greater than the Holy One. Blessed be he, heaven forfend. So here we have a powerful defense, even of the position of Ibn Ezra, which at first we were kind of shaky on it, right? Makes no sense. Why would the Jews be afflicted with the plagues when we understand the goal was complete annihilation of the Egyptian deity, the Nile River? It had to affect even the Jews as well. So this idea that there are times when God will not make a distinction, even though you can make an argument that perhaps he should have, follows a principle in Jewish law that is called loy plug. Right? The word loy plug means sometimes our sages made a rule and they apply the rule across the board. It is a blanket rule. Even though you could make an argument that in certain circumstances the rule should not apply, nevertheless, it's a blanket rule. What is an example of that? Anyone who goes to shul notices that there's something different that takes place in shul than when you daven at home. When a person davens at home, we recite the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei, one time. When you go to shul and you're davening with the minyan, we have a repetition of the Amidah. Why? We just read it. Why do we have a repetition of the Amidah? The answer is that in the biblical era, in the era of the temple, when these prayers were formulated, not everyone had a siddur. There was no printing presses. They didn't exist. Not everyone had a prayer book. Not everyone knew the prayer by heart. So people came to daven and they weren't capable of doing it. So our sages instituted something that's called the repetition of the Amidah, that the chazan will recite the Amidah on behalf of all of the people who are in shul who don't know how to read or don't know the prayer by heart and can't pray themselves. So by answering Amen, listening to the prayers and answering Amen to all of the blessings, you will fulfill your obligation. Now, today, we do have a prayer book. 99.9% of people who go to shul today can read either Hebrew or English. So if you can't read the Hebrew, you can read the English and you fulfill your prayer. So perhaps we don't need to have the repetition of the Amidah anymore. However, Jewish tradition says this is lo plug. We're not making we're not leaving it up to debate and discussion to loopholes. This is the rule. We are applying it universally everywhere. There's always a repetition of the Amidah, even when you can argue that it's not necessary. Another example. When a person wakes up in the morning, right, we are obligated to wash our hands. We have a cup with water. We pour it over our right, our left. We do it 3 times, we're alternating our right hand and our left hand. What if a person is up the whole night? Do you need to wash your hands? Now, the only reason for washing your hands is because you slept. That's the reason to wash your hands. Based on the reason, if you were up the whole night, I know Mitchell every once in a while, he's partying a little bit, he has a few l'chaims, right? He's singing, he's dancing, he's out the whole night. And he didn't even go to sleep. The Torah says, Mitchell, you still have to wash your hands in the morning, even though you were awake the whole night. Why? Lo plug. We're not making distinctions. We're not making differences. We're not leaving the rule open to maybe I think yes, maybe I think no. That's not going to be the case. Why is that? The reason is rules fall apart when inconsistently applied or with too many exceptions. Okay. Now, let's go back to this for a second. Now, this doesn't mean that every single rule in Judaism has this principle. That's not the case. But there are many rules in Judaism where this applies. And the logic behind it is very clear, straightforward, and makes a lot of sense. Rules fall apart when inconsistently applied or with too many exceptions. All of a sudden, the rule fades away, melts away, disappears because you argued yourself out of it. So sometimes we say, this is the rule, period. It's necessary and it's valuable. Now, this brings us to the lesson that we need to learn from this whole story. And we'll begin the lesson with a question. What principle do you hold but struggle to live up to? What values do you have? What mitzvahs perhaps do you cherish that you very much would like to implement into your life? However, you find that you can argue your way out of them more often than you argue yourself into them. Or perhaps you're pretty good with it 80% of the time, 90% of the time, but perhaps you struggle to live up to that at a certain percentage of that time. What does that say about your commitment? What does it say about your values, your morals, your ethics, those mitzvahs? What does that say about you? And in the long term, what happens when they slowly erode away? In life, we need to draw red lines. We need to have certain values, certain commitments, morally, ethically, religiously, that we say there is no excuse, there is no loophole, there is no circumstance that is going to allow me to violate and to contradict it, even though there might be reason to in this situation. Because once I do that, everything falls away, everything disappears. Right? This is an idea that can apply to so many circumstances in life. Let's say you believe in XYZ particular moral ethical principle, and you proclaim it. You publicly proclaim it. And you know what? When you see a politician that is the opposite side of your political party committing those acts, you proudly proclaim your morality, your ethics, and how that person is a ruthless, degenerate individual. However, if you are so committed to morality and ethics, what happens when a political leader from your political party commits the exact same thing? If in that circumstance you're justifying it and you're explaining it and you're rationalizing it away, your commitment to that level of morality and ethics, not so strong. Right? If you believe in it, you believe in it whether it's your political party or whether it's the opposition's political party. You can't only criticize it when it happens to the other political party. The same thing applies to many of our own personal commitments. And I know we've had some of these discussions in past classes before. Let's say a person makes a commitment that they're going to start keeping kosher, or that they're going to start coming to shul every Shabbos, something like that. But their spouse, not so excited about it, right? They're not so in love that they're decided coming to shul every Shabbos, and that they're only eating kosher and not going to restaurants, and they're kind of bothering them a little bit about it. If a person demonstrates to their spouse that I mean it for real, like I'm committed to it, that I'm going to go to shul every Shabbos and I'm not going to skip for anything, then they're going to respect you. But if you say, I'm going to go to shul every Shabbos, except for when the Packers are playing on Shabbos. When the Packers are playing on Shabbos, then I won't go to shul. How deep is your commitment to going to shul? If it's going to fade away, it's going to disappear because you rationalize it away. The same thing. I'm only keeping kosher. I will only go to a restaurant if it's with my boss, right? With my boss, I go to the restaurant, but I'm not going to go with anyone else. Okay, that's also not going to go anywhere. Now, by saying this, I don't want to discourage people from making small commitments. Like a person can make a commitment, I'm going to go to shul once a month. Or a person can make a commitment when it comes to kosher that I'm going to only, I'm going to try to do one level of kosher, right? You can start with, all right, no pork products in my house, but maybe the chicken is not kosher, but at least it's not pork, right? And eventually you graduate, right? That not only is it no pork, but the chicken itself is going to be kosher, right? And when you go out to restaurants, it's not just that you're not going to order, milk and meat mixed together. You're only going to order vegetarian. And then eventually you could grow to only kosher. So I'm not negating doing things in steps, right? The point is that sometimes you have to have a principle, you have to have a value, and it has to apply equally across the board. You almost have to sacrifice for it because it's the truth, because it's real. Otherwise, it's going to disappear and it's going to fall away. Right? Let's go to text number 13. This is from the Medrash, Shemais Rabbah. Said Rabbi Ami, when the Jewish people are described as stubborn, people normally understand this as a criticism, but in fact, it's a compliment. It is due to our stubbornness that we have been willing to be killed for our Judaism. Stubborn can be a negative character trait, depending on the circumstance, but applied correctly, a stubbornness, right, a steadfast commitment to the religious values that we believe in, to the morals and ethics that we uphold, to the mitzvahs in our life, a stubborn commitment. This is what has kept the Jewish people and will keep the Jewish people. If our kids or our grandchildren see that our commitment is wavering, that a Packers game could throw everything off, right? Or an attractive piece of food could throw everything off, why should they teach it to their children or to the next generation? But when they see it's a value that is clear, that there is a red line that's not crossed, there's a stubbornness, right? Our children and our grandchildren will feel that same sense of urgency in our life when we draw a line in it and stick to it. The Code of Jewish Law makes a very important and interesting comment about the nature of our commitments. Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Yosef Cairo is the author. He was born in 1488. He passed away in the year 1575. He was a halachic authority and author. Rabbi Cairo was born in Spain. It looks like today we're learning all about Spanish rabbis, but was forced to flee during the expulsion in 1492 and eventually settled in the city of Tzfas in Israel. So he lived at the same time and was a contemporary of the Radbaz, Rabbi David ibn Ezra, that we mentioned before. And they lived in the same city in Israel. He authored many works, including the Beis Yosef, the Kesef Mishnah, and a mystical work, Magid Meisharim. Rabbi Cairo's magnum opus, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, has been universally accepted as the basis for modern Jewish law, and this is what he says about commitments. One should have a set time to learn Torah. The set time to learn Torah should not be altered, even to allow for a large increase in revenue. He says, if a person made a commitment, right, I am studying Torah, all right, we'll just use this class as an example, right? But don't take it too seriously. But Tuesday night, 7:30, this is my schedule. I'm going to study Torah then. Rabbi Cairo says, don't change it for anything. If you value it, right, if you think this is important, this is meaningful, Torah study is important, then I have a class. We don't just say, oh, today I'm doing something else, I have to go somewhere else. No. Schedule your life around the values that you think are important. And he gives an example. You have a business opportunity to perhaps earn a lot of money, says that you don't skip your Torah class for that. Don't skip your Torah class for that. Now, I'm not saying there's no excuses to miss a Torah class, right? If it's your child's wedding, you go to your child's wedding and say, I can't come to the chuppah, sorry, I got a Torah class on Tuesday night. That's not what I mean, right? What I mean is, when a person has priorities in your life, that is the foundation, that is the core, that's what roots your life. And if you're going to have to miss it or you have to skip it, it's going to have to be for something that is of real, true, and everlasting value. Right? We're not just going to cancel a Torah class unless there's something that is somehow of equal or greater value to my time. Right? Otherwise, it's never going to happen. To give you just an example of this, So I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and the gabbai and the treasurer of the Chabad shul and of the Chabad day school is named Jeffrey Kimball. Now, we've actually shown a few videos of interactions with him and the Rebbe in previous classes. He is a lawyer and a tremendous supporter of Chabad in Springfield, Massachusetts, to the extent his mother-in-law is in Milwaukee and Fox Point. So he literally lives a few blocks from the shul. Jeffrey Kimball's mother-in-law. His wife is from Milwaukee. So he gives more than half of his income to tzedakah, right? More than half of his income he gives to tzedakah, to charity. And he was audited by the IRS, right? Audited by the IRS. I mean, those type of tax returns, they're going to want to take a look at it. So he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe saying, what am I supposed to do? I'm audited. They're driving me crazy. The Rebbe gave him a blessing, and he says, don't worry, everything is going to be fine, right? He says, commit yourself to having fixed times for learning, right? That's what you need to do. So the first thing he wanted to do is tell the IRS, I got a blessing from the Rebbe, so you could just stop now. No reason to go further. But of course, he was vindicated that his charitable donations, more than half of his income, was quite real, and he was able to prove it. But from that time on, he had fixed times for studying Torah, and he did not change that. He did not alter it. He did not cancel that easily. How do I know? Because he studied with my father every Tuesday night. Every Tuesday night, Jeffrey Kimball knocked on that door, and he was there to learn with my father. There would have to be a fire burning something down for him to miss that, because this was real, it was true, it was a value, it was important, and he was committed to it. That doesn't mean there was never a time that he missed it, but it was solid, it was rooted in his life. So we have to reflect upon, and we learn from this parsha, what are the values that I hold dear, that I'm going to draw that red line? What elements am I going to cancel? When am I going to compromise? Does that make me a hypocrite? Not a hypocrite. We need to reflect on these things, and we need to embrace this fabulous Jewish character trait of being stubborn. Stubborn and committed to that which is good, holy, righteous, positive, and we know to be true, and ultimately will bring the most incredible blessings to our life. I want to give a minute for questions and answers, but I don't want to forget about this announcement. The next JLI class, which we're doing, is going to be on Monday, February 1st. In the past, I did these classes on Wednesday night. However, for this course, I'm doing it on Monday because Rabbi Shmutkin, who teaches JLI in Glendale on Monday, is not able to do this course, so we're merging our classes. So the Wednesday night class for this course is going to be on Monday. So Monday, February 1st at 7:30. If anything changes in the time, I will let people know, but I want to give people a heads up that it's going to be 6-week class, Monday, February 1st at 7:30. It's called Journey of the Soul. So where do we go from here? Take a fresh look at life, death, and rest in peace. So we're going to be exploring the nature of the soul. What does Judaism have to say about death? The laws of mourning, everything related to mourning, Kaddish, the afterlife, resurrection of the dead, everything that has to do with, again, life, death, and rest in peace. And it's a high quality course. Doctors will get continuing medical education credit for attending this course, as well as psychologists, therapists, and so on. So there is another benefit for attending this class. I will be sending emails, physical letters, the brochures with all this information. If you would like to attend, it would be fabulous. I think you certainly would gain a lot. And please let anyone know who might be interested, especially doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and things of that nature, because they can get credit. All right, any questions, comments on this class or anything else? I see we have a chat here. Okay, you're very welcome, Michelle. All right, any questions, comments? All right, if we are all good.